and particularly the teachings. And I think that's what is very, very important. It's not just acknowledging, but also working with the teachings. And this is why we talk about it as we are a collective. There's nothing like your people, it's our people, right? And it's a collective that we talk about it. But I also want to recognize our elders and ancestors, and particularly invite our ancestors into the room, because they help guide us. And as they always teach us, we need to walk alongside. And we do with, we never do for. But particularly when we talk of African History Month, one of the things for us to recognize is that for us as a people, nothing about us without us. There's a reason why this year, for example, we talk about it as our stories, retelling our stories. And that's very, very important. Because sometimes people want us to perform anti-Black racism. They want us to perform the pain and the trauma. And we refuse that. Refusing to perform, to me, is raising a couple of things. That we are not here simply talking about reconciliation and healing as building relationships, but it's asking for an end to coloniality and oppressions. That's what we are asking for. So not all this lip service where we talk about, oh, Algoma University, there's no racism here. Let's admit there's racism. And we work to address it, and not let's be nicey about it. I'm glad I was invited and to see friends in the room, and I want to thank everyone who had a hand to bring me here. I think it's very, very important. I also note that we can't talk about this movement without mentioning what my friend Denise, you mentioned. This idea of speaking out and speaking up is very, very important. As we heard a powerful speaker, and it's something I've always been saying, right? There are many, many of us, we go into spaces, we forget the history that bring us into those spaces. So we become silent, we become complicit, without recognizing that people had to fight to open doors, that we stand on the shoulders of those who had to fight to make our voices be heard. And some of us are still struggling for our voices to be heard. And that's what one of my doctoral students, Sefa Dei, says, if it ain't critical, it is not anti-racist. Neither is it decolonial or anti-colonial. But also, if we don't get it right from the beginning, we will end badly. That's why where we start is very, very significant, because it's connected to where we end. And that's my good friend Molifia Santi says, in fact, where we stand has a lot to do with what and how far we see. So I'll be remiss if I didn't mention some of the teachings of my African ancestry. When, for example, he said it's not important, or it's not most important what one is called, but what one responds to. When you are called, what do you respond to? What is the call you respond to? And then we hear all this saying about it takes a village to raise a child. We all mouth it, we say it, repeat it, but I don't think people understand it. Of course, we know it takes a collective to raise a child, but that's not the point. The point is you must create that collective. You must have the community to be able to have or raise a child. So it's not just simply saying it takes a village, because we know it takes a collective, but you must create it. You must work to build it. We talk about ours, ours, we. not yours, 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 yours. I want to have this. And by the way, I should say, look, I asked for the organizers to give me some more time, because these discussions are not discussions we have over 30, 40 minutes. I want to have some time, and we need to have some time to talk about the issues. We need to have some time to talk about the issues. So I want to spend some time and run through the issues. But I also give time for questions, because these are not issues we can talk about in 30 minutes, 40 minutes. We need time and be serious about them. So I think we can talk about it as African History Month when we are also dealing with the pain of Black death. And in particular, as Dionysus mentioned, the killing of Tyre Nichols. And this touches us. Remember, I used the word touch. Touch is that flashlight. It offers a flashlight on us, not touch in terms of touching somebody, but it offers a flashlight on all of us. Because of the ongoing need to humanize Blackness and the racialized. We talk about the touching feeling of seeing a son who tattoos his mother's name on his arm and dies crying for her. That is so touching. As Dionysus said, it reveals the systemic and institutionalized racism. You know, people hear about the nonsense people talk about. This has nothing to do with race, because it was a group of Black police officers who killed the Black man. It has everything to do with race, exactly. And there's no time for me to go through this, but we all know it's a Black body. The way Black bodies are dehumanized, that's why they think they should be brutalized. Come to think of it, you think a group of Black police thugs, as our captain said, would do the same to a white working class man? No, it's because Black bodies have been, and it's part of the institutionalized culture. That's what I mean by the speaking out and speaking up. We need to call it and not be afraid. The institutionalized culture, whether it's in the media, in education, in the police, the brutality, we need to call it out. And sometimes we think about, oh, this is the US, and Canada has this sense of complacency, just to position. We have parallels of these issues here. It's a question of degrees, and we should be concerned about it. We shouldn't be afraid to speak about it, because people had to die for us to be where we are, and we should not be afraid to speak about these issues. So when people say, well, protest in peace, don't disturb the peace, why should we not disturb the peace when there's so much violence? Let's get serious. So history and context here, which we all know, but it's very, very important to put it. Right? There's this long history of what some of us will call the pandemic of anti-Black racism. You look at it, it's the way it's enacted around the Canadian landscape. You see it in the education system, health, judicial system, housing, immigration, and so forth. But it's part of Western modernity now in the coloniality of Black lives. So many specific examples. Immigration exclusions, historically, erasures of Black presence, like we heard in the introduction, our contributions in history, what have happened in Africville. Even the fact that people have a very negative reaction to the notion of Black Lives Matter. So you hear these things about all lives matter. Of course, all lives matter. The reason we say Black Lives Matter is because Black lives have not mattered. So don't give me that racist response. All lives matter when we talk about Black Lives Matter. It's a racist response. Call it for what it is. And for some of us, when we voice these concerns, not only are we silenced, but we are under threat. But if you have the ancestors on your side, if you have the creator on your side, if you have the supreme on your side, you need not fear. This pervasiveness of color blindness, I don't see any color. The insult of that, the problem is not the color, it's the interpretation of the color. That is the problem, not the color. If you walk into a room and say, I don't see any color, that's an insult. It's the interpretation of that color. The fact that if you think that color, and if that color is black, it means inferior. That is a problem. If that color is white and you think it's superior, that is a problem. So it's the interpretation. You know, sometimes people talk about, well, maybe, well, I can't claim to relate to racism. Let's grant that. Let's grant that. I can't claim to relate to racism. Maybe because you haven't experienced it. But remember, sometimes even if you haven't experienced it, sometimes you have been a perpetrator. But even let's grant that notion that you can't claim to relate to racism. But everyone can relate to experiences of exclusion and marginality. Everyone. So use that as an entry point to address some of these issues. How did you feel when you felt excluded? How did you feel when you felt marginalized? How did you feel when your voice didn't count? Use that as an entry point for the work that we want to do. Let's use that. And this is why the restoring of our lives is so important, because it's not just simply an intellectual exercise, it is also a political exercise. But the late who talks about coming to voice. So this restoring of our lives is a political and an intellectual. It talks about ethics and responsibilities. But it's also that restoring is making our institutions a healing place or healing places where we connect and reconnect, we promote self-love, and we activate our individual and collective agencies. That's the only place if you want to collectively heal. And this is why I talk about this notion of radical placemaking. That's so important. Radical placemaking. Because it's in pursuit of human freedom and true liberation within these radical places. And long ago, Amy Cesare, the anti-colonial theorist, taught us that finding that center, finding one center is so important to this work. Wherever we are, we want to find our center. Finding our center to me, finding one's voice, being able to find one voice wherever we find ourselves. There are some discussion stances that are very important in these discussions. We look at the global reckoning on race, anti-Blackness, the cultism of white nationalism, white supremacist logics. The way anti-racism is being performed, because the performativity of anti-racism that Sarah Ahmed long ago talked about, is still something that we have to look at, because it's becoming a celebratory approach. So Black Lives Matter, when George Floyd was killed, we saw all these solidarity statements. I'm glad with that because people haven't repeated that because we are tired of the solidarity statements. Action is what is called for. But if you say action is called for, we must name issues for what they are. Don't say discrimination when it's racism, when it's oppression, when it's violence. Don't say bias when it's violence. Name it for what it is. Because there's a lot of evasiveness, race-evasiveness. And that race-evasiveness works with this inability to name and act on race and other oppressions. Anti-Blackness, anti-Indigeneity, anti-Asianness, white supremacy, and its heteropatriarchal logics. So we need to question this idea of where EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, becomes a performance and an authentic action. We also need to see how our institutions, in particular for me, being working in schools, how they become carceral places. It doesn't mean they are not good people working, but they are carceral places. Because you look at the curriculum, who is in the curriculum? Who is not? Who is teaching? Who is not? Who is validated? Who is not? That's why they are carceral places. That enduring problem of academic coloniality, the hierarchies, where rather than thinking in circles, that we are a collective, that we are a schooling community, a community of learners, people begin to think in hierarchies. Who is smart? Who is dumb? Who is intellectual? Or who is intellectual? We really need to understand Black pain and suffering, and not to just oppose it with our fears and anxieties. Earlier when I talk about Black Lives Matter and somebody says all lives matter. Well, some will not say all lives matter, but they will say, well, law and order. Law and order, we all want law and order. We all want that. So you can't just oppose when somebody says Black Lives Matter with law and order, because we all want law and order. But as I said, people would disturb the peace when there's still the inhumanity, the dehumanization. So our institutions cannot continue to be expectations of whiteness, where there's this conformity, policing, surveillance, punishment. In many ways, in varied ways, that we need to be very, very critical and look at it. The performance, the policing. We police about what is valid knowledge. We ask students to conform to certain ideas, and if they don't conform, there's punishment. If they don't conform, it's transgression. And in one of our working schools, when students would talk about, well, when we walk in the hallways, we feel like there's a constant microscope that is trained on us, given who we are. That's surveillance. How do you explain it? Now we talk about decolonization, the way it's become a way to oppose whiteness in academia. And that's long ago, Sandy Grant, the indigenous scholar Sandy Grant talked about. Our schools, our universities have become, quote, an arm of the settler state. And that's why we need to resist a very monolithic construction of white settlerhood and begin to help position ourselves in critical anti-colonial theorizing and practice as social agents who inhabit our multiple beings and being seen. Lena Simpson work tells us that we can't dismantle white supremacy without calling for building new futures. And we are not just living in the present. If we live in the present, that's a problem. We have to build new futures. So we are not just living in the present, we must build new futures as we live now. And also remember that in this way that we talk about, there are no gatekeepers. There should be no gatekeepers. Look, Nana hasn't seen it. Sule is not the all-knower. Jane doesn't know everything. We must recognize the history that brings us to this work and understand where people are at the different stages of learning on this journey and the limits of our knowing on this journey. Because when we do that, we are bringing humility to the work. Just because one is Black, just because one is racialized, just because one is indigenous, doesn't mean they're always going to get it right. No. So we have to be very humble. But being humble doesn't mean you must not voice your pain, your suffering, and your anger. And part of this work, it's all about true liberation for everyone. Not just for Black, indigenous, or racialized, but true liberation for everyone. And it should never be work which is for a select few. It should never be work which is for a select few. Doing this work, it should not be for a select few. It should be for all of us, because we are talking about building collective futures. But in doing this work, we need to talk about the politics of hope and possibilities rather than limitations, and the cynicism. The cynicism can immobilize us. Let's talk about possibilities and hopes. Because with the power and the privileges that we enjoy in our different locations, there are power and privileges that we enjoy, whether you are racialized, whether you are brown, whether you are Asian, whether you are indigenous. There are certain privileges and powers that we enjoy. But what we should do with that is to commit to something which is bigger than ourselves. Fanon a long time ago talked about this. Foucault mentioned it also, that you cannot have violence without resistance. And by the same way, the anti-colonial is as long as colonial. And one of my students, Mary Carmen, also writes about this. There's no oppression without resistance. Never, no place has there been oppression without resistance. Even in enslavement, people resisted, but we don't hear that. In enslavement, in Black enslavement, there was resistance, but we don't hear that. So kind reckoning of race and anti-Blackness and the anti-colonial offers us a read of what is the blatant disregard for lives that are not white. I don't need to say more about this. Our tragedy is normalized, whether it's in the media. The continued devaluation of certain bodies, our theories, our ways of knowing. We hear this misguided cries of something people call wokeism. And the misinformation about it. So as Collinson writes about the conspiracy theories, the lies, the cultural wars that people manufacture, they are all barely concealed forms of racism. They are meant to distract our attention. The muscling of anti-racist speech, because people have a desire to return to this colorblind environment. This settler retrenchment with the lies and how legislation is now part of this conversation. So we see it in this vicious backlash around anti-racist education, that somehow is a threat to a way of life. The US, it has a squarely in Canadian context, is moving here, and we need to be very vigilant. In places where even critical race theory is not being taught, there's a whole manufactured story about, oh, how do we teach our young learners critical race theory? When some of us even are begging for schools to teach race. And yet there's all this concocted story that is being taught to our learners. In the US, they call a group called Moms for Liberty. Liberty for who? Liberty for upper class, working class women. And they have the right to tell teachers what they should teach all kids. That somehow when you teach Black history, you make white kids feel bad. Really? We need to be honest and speak out. These grievances. So we talk about the angry white male. Let's call it out. But even for anti-racist and anti-Black racism work, there's also something that I'm seeing now, and that also we should call it out. It's now we are being asked to move away from what people see as a very simplistic Black-white duality, right? That we can't read the world in black and white. Of course, I agree that the world is complex, but we cannot move away from a Black-white prism. We can do away with the binary, but we should hold on to a prism, because the prism is relevant to understand how whiteness and global white supremacy works. Everywhere whiteness is valued, is privileged. Even in my own birthplace in Ghana, whiteness is privileged. And so this is why we have to hold on to this white paradigmatic lens, not the binary. So if people are asking us to move away from the simple reading of black and white, yes, but we should hold on to the black-white binary, because globally it works every space. Brazil, Latin America, Jamaica, Africa, Asia, everywhere, a closer proximity to whiteness is rewarded, while the proximity to blackness is punished. And when I talk about holding on to the black-white prism, I'm not negating the colonial impact on indigenous peoples. No, neither is this a hierarchy of oppression. I'm only talking about a critical understanding of social reality. And what it does is it helps us to complicate the indigenous settler binaries that sometimes we work with. So what I'm saying, in fact, is that the black-white binary needs to be deconstructed, not because it has not worked in the past, not because it has not been part of a colonial logic, but rather it's been false. And it doesn't help towards building cross-racial dialogue and solidarity. But we should hold on to a black-white prism. Black-white prism is not the same as a black-white binary. And this is so important. Conceptualizing anti-blackness, let me write a couple of things here. We know what anti-blackness is. The social, historical, political dimensions of Black existence. The hostilities that it speaks to, the violence that are mapped on the congeniality of the Black body. But this violence is race, is class, is gendered, it's sexualized. And it manifests itself in history, politics, and culture. And that's why it helps to extend the meaning of anti-Blackness beyond anti-Black racism. It becomes a systemic practice, which is operationalized through racial hierarchies, with certain bodies at the bottom of that hierarchy. And it has the support of institutionalized power. One of the things I talk about when people talk about, well, what is this institutionalized thing you're talking about? I'll say, look no far, right? So when there was that incident of the Coopers in New York, and the lady who was watching the birds, right, said she was going to call the New York police to complain that she was being harassed by a Black person. She didn't say, I'm going to call officer A or B in New York Police Department. He just said, I'm going to call the New York Police Department. He's talking about an institution, right? So when people say they don't understand that systemic, I don't know what they're talking about. The systemic is not individualized. It's embedded in the culture. And when we look at anti-Black racism in particular, the way it is rooted in slavery, in Euro-colonialism, heteropatriarchal capitalism, with its denial of the African humanhood through history. And we are still dealing with that today. If Charles Nichols doesn't tell us that, then you have a problem. What are some of the manifestations? As I said, we have to see them beyond the individual conceptions, the feelings and perceptions, and look at it in the policies. Not just the individual, the attitudes, the perceptions, but the structure and the systemic issues become very, very important. And the cultural projects that I spoke about. We also have to see how it's embedded in Western European ideals and values. They believe in European superiority, Western civilization. Ideas and values that are enshrined within our institutions, the way our institutions are supposed to operate, that our institutions are supposed to be fair, they are value-free, they are objective, and they work with merit and excellence as its core values. And that what we should uphold is color blindness, and that we should treat everybody the same. Of course, this treating everybody the same is the ideal, but we haven't gotten there yet because of the systemic inequities. This is why that limit, that saying, is so dangerous without dissecting it. Sometimes you have to target our responses to those who have historically been disenfranchised within the system. These values I'm talking about, they cannot be the yardstick through which everything else is measured, as Shelley Steinbeck and the late Joe Kinslow talks about Eurocentrism. The way it defines what is normal, what is acceptable, and what is deemed rewarding or rewardable. We should challenge that. But the culture for institutions are also built in a culture of denialism, a culture of silence and silencing of courage and inaction. I talk about, look, and some of my friends here in the room will see, look, you can be in academia, right, and never speak about race. And you go far because you're going to be seen as what? An intellectual. You start speaking about race, anti-Black racism, and they say, oh, there goes the angry guy. There goes the angry scholar. Because you're speaking truth to power. So we have to see how our institutions reward silence. They reward denials. They reward complicities while they punish those who have the courage to resist. That's anti-Black racism, the manifestations. When you look in the area of representation, in knowledge, whose knowledge is the visual landscapes of and cultures of our school. As Stacey Abrams talks about, you cannot be what one cannot see. This is why representation is so important. Then there's a burden of representation. Being the Black body, the only Black, Indigenous, or racialized body within a particular setting. That burden that is placed on that body. So when you carry so many things on your shoulder, it's like we talk about carrying the cross. And then this claims of homogeneous Blackness that denies our multidimensionality. It denies our complexity and the nuances of Blacknesses in the plural. How gender, sexuality, class, geography, location, Black cartographies and speciologies in terms of lands and geographies. Of course, there are connecting links, but there are some subtleties, right? What does it mean to be Black in Brazil? What does it mean to be Black on the continent? What does it mean to be Black in the Caribbean? There are convergences, but there are also some specificities that we need to talk about. So when people talk about people are homogenizing Blackness, please let's ask who is doing it. Who are those who are homogenizing Blackness? It's not Black peoples. When the police stops the Black body, they are not asking, is he African? Is he from Jamaica? Or is he from Ghana? That's homogenized Blackness. Who is doing it? Let's call it out. And stop this charade that when some of us talk about these things, we are talking about homogenized Blackness. Of course, Blackness is racialized, gendered. class. But also there are different shades of anti-Blackness. Even within Black bodies, there's anti-Blackness, right? How else do you explain the murder of Tal Nichols? That's Black anti-Blackness. There's Indigenous anti-Blackness. There's racialized anti-Blackness. And of course, there's white anti-Blackness. So let's talk about the different dimensions when we speak about that also. And also what we acknowledge. So sometimes I share these personal examples growing up in Ghana, and Sule would see what I'm getting at, right? Where you begin to learn more about what exists in somebody else's context than in your own village, in your own town. So you learn more about Niagara Falls than the village, the rivers and the streams in your own town or community where your mother caught the fish that was cooked at the night for you to eat. This is why we talk about the problem of colonial naming. So you go to Zimbabwe, there's a waterfalls, right? What's it called? Victoria Waterfalls. And you ask, oh, it was discovered by this explorer called Captain Victoria. Give me a break. What about the indigenous people who showed that foreigner to the waterfall? So nothing ever existed until it was discovered by a particular body. Gradually today, people are waking up. This is why in South Africa, they talk about, since the roads must come down, we should rename our streets, rename our architectures, because we cannot celebrate our colonizers. What we celebrate is a problem. What our children learn in schools. The other day I was talking about, one of my former students talking about a title of a paper that gave me for a conference, saying, nothing personal, I would rather be reading Willie Soyinka. Now, if you were to ask me who is Willie Soyinka, that is the problem. So we know more about Shakespeare, but we don't know more about this African playwright, critical literary scholars, whether it's Chinua Achebe, Chimamanda Adichie, Amata Edu, and so forth. Nobody is saying don't learn about Shakespeare. Of course we should learn, but we should also learn. That is African history. Learn about these other African playwrights, these indigenous literary scholars, these Asian literatures. Let's learn up, because knowledge is very distributed in our wider community. It's not a monopoly of one group. So the predicament of anti-Blackness. Long time ago, Grandma Millers in her work talks about that educational debt. That there's a cumulative impact of anti-Black racism that has produced an educational debt owed to Black communities. And it's still true to this day. The system's obsession with brutalizing Black bodies is still true to this day. This is why we have to be in a constant gaze of the whitewashing and the brainwashing mechanisms that exploit and degenerate Black existence, our labor, our knowledge, through the creative, racialized political economy. Nowhere is this so clear in the music than in the music industry, right? Black bodies are celebrated because they offer something for consumption, but they are repulsed. Shut up and dribble. Who was told that? Shut up and dribble. Don't talk about anti-Black racism. Don't talk about violence. Don't talk about police brutality. All what you have to do is shut up and dribble, or shut up and sing. That's what is expected of you. If that's not anti-Black racism, what it is. And there are traces of that we can see. What I'm getting at is how white supremacy and anti-Blackness work in tandem to produce Black social death, the social death that Oscar Patterson was speaking about. You murder people, not only physically, but emotionally, psychologically, that they don't count, right? When a Black child sees what is happening with a Black body being beaten, the impact that it has is emotional murder. Not just the physical murder of that person, but the emotional torture, the trauma. This is why we need to ask the question, what conditions are required for our Black bodies, our learners to thrive? Then on the question of perceiving Blackness, it's replete with contradictions, tensions, ambiguities. We need to understand Blackness on its own, but also acknowledging that it intersects with other concepts. This understanding of Blackness is so important, right? Because we have a way where Blackness is always juxtaposed with whiteness. Let's understand Blackness on its own. There's a conception of Blackness in African indigeneity that have nothing to do with whiteness. Let's be honest. And Blackness should never be made coterminous with dominant masculinity. It should never be made coterminous with that. And to always recognize, in terms of perceiving Blackness, how mythologies can immortalize aspects of Blackness for resistance. So our myths become so important because part of our myths is to learn the stories of Sojourner Truth, the Yas and Tuas, how they mobilize people for resistance, and they become powerful mythologies that we should never forget and teach our children. That this Blackness is about identity, it's about politics, it's about representation, body image, and experience. But to recognize, as I've been saying, that it's located within the context of where it exists. Different lands and geographies doesn't mean there are no convergences. So the scholar, looking at the school and the workplace as fugitive space, as Martin Haney talks about. When we look at some of the realities of decolonization, why it means to the center responsibilities, because what it does is that the burden now on decolonization is being loaded onto us, right? Our institutions have adopted this liberal approaches. So we give you the curriculum inclusions, the courses, but don't ask for the teachers. African history, celebrate, bring your dance, your African customs, wear, let's celebrate. But don't ask us to give us don't ask us to give you the teachers. We speak about so-called microaggressions. To me, I say there's nothing called microaggressions. Call it what it is. There are aggressions. They are not microaggressions. The impact, it's as severe. These empty, lofty promises that our schools retain, they reify colonial power and cultural futurity through this cock of reconciliation. But as Linda Smith talked about long ago, right, there are many parts of this decolonization that we should recognize. But to me, what is very, very important is that if you're going to embark on this path, then we should be grounded in decolonial Black and Indigenous ontologies and epistemes. You cannot decolonize through Western science scholarship. It doesn't mean Western science scholarship is not important, but it is part of the problem. So if you want to decolonize, we have to talk about indigenous African ontologies and philosophies, if you're really serious about it. This is why it begins by asking new questions. It also has to be a subversive act. It has to be a subversive act. It cannot be something which is mainstream. How can you talk about something being mainstreamed and say it's decolonial when you have mainstreamed it? It cannot be under the cover. It can't be under the cover scholarship. Our work cannot be, it cannot be hidden under the cover scholarship. It has been open. As again, one of my students, Lord Henry talks about, it's become such a buzzword now that sometimes it's reached like rearranging the colonial furniture. And people see that as decolonization. We rearrange the colonial furniture, and that is decolonization. Let's recognize what Linda Smith talked about a long time, the reach of imperialism into our heads. And Wimark's point, that power of unchaining our minds. We need to unchain our minds, that power. And part of that unchaining our minds is to see the link between decolonization and settler decolonization. Because settler decolonization starts from a particular point, land. But decolonization, say in Africa, starts with the question of what Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about, that consciousness. And this is why I speak about the metaphoricity of decolonization as equally important as decolonization is not a metaphor, as Eve Tak talks about. Yes, decolonization is not a metaphor, but we should also speak about the metaphoricity of decolonization. How does one get the idea that decolonization is not a metaphor? That's a consciousness. It's a knowledge base. But Jackson talks about hope and futurity because that should be part of the conversations. It's not just about challenging or disconcerting the colonial rating, but to work with hope that we have the power to articulate new futures. And when we engage decolonization anti-colonial, to see one as a path, a process, and the anti-colonial is to the end. But always mindful that even as we try to decolonize, the colonial is lurching behind, wanting to bring us back. Because sometimes even our decolonial languages morph into forms of colonization. Can we dismantle colonial systems? If so, how? I think abolition is very important. And abolition is not inclusion. It has to be interruption, disruption, subversion. But it has to work with the past. It's not a break from the past. That's the problem with the way some people talk about abolition. They talk about abolition as if it's a new break. No, abolition cannot break from the past because the past has lessons to offer us. So let's be mindful how we talk about abolition. Otherwise, it becomes a problem. There's something like a break because our world is in a spiral. The back, the present, the past, and the future. When we talk about African History Month, it's reclaiming the past, reflecting on the present, and projecting onto the future. That's what African History Month is about. Reflect on the past, reclaim the past, reflect on the present, and project onto the future. But to see abolition in terms of really genuine decolonization, that tabula rasa that Fanon talks about, an authentic commitment with a consciousness. And sometimes it would involve armed resistance and struggles. It cannot be the false flag. The idea that, well, it's the same train, but it's just a different driver. It cannot be that. If we are really serious about decolonization, it cannot be the same train, but a different driver. That's not decolonization. That's what Sandra Stiles talks about, how the state and quality of being indigenous is so important, and to begin to work with land and indigenous pedagogies as that great. Earlier on, I talked about the university as a fugitive space. It's very, very important because we are not in these spaces to simply learn. We have to be activists. We also have to work with radical speculative measures and asking, we have every right to be in the university space, but we shouldn't let the universities make us who we are. Because through decolonization or through resistance, we sow the seeds of our own decolonization. Because the universities they become places which are gatekeeping, and we have to resist. You have to resist. The universities grow as a gatekeeper, whether it's knowledge, whether it's research or methodologies. and embrace the honey's point that we flee from the cultural projects, but we don't live it because the universities, we have every place to be there, right? So to flee without living, but in honey. So we flee from the cultural projects, but we don't live because we want to change it. So to me, my politics of refusal is working within, working around, and working from outside. It's not either or. Some of us need to be in to change it. Some of us have to be outside, and some of us have to work. We have to embrace those indigenous elsewheres, as indigenous scholars talk about, because they offer us a path for imagining new futures. That indigenous elsewheres, they offer us a path to imagine new futures. I now talked about disruptive remodeling, so I want to skip and then just get to the whole side of I want to talk about Black and Indigenous solidarities because it's very important before I sum up. Just a few minutes on that, and I know I have to give some time for questions. I think race is it must be central thesis in indigeneity and decolonization, right? You cannot talk about race and indigeneity, or you cannot talk about indigeneity and decolonization when race is silent. There's a tendency for some to actually keep race silent when they talk about indigeneity and decolonization. We can't do that. So Blackness and indigeneity must be intertwined because they have worked in the production of the white nationhood. As Harris talked about, settler colonialism was deployed in ways to implicate race, genocide, and dispossessions. And that's why it's so important for us to see how anti-Blackness works alongside settler colonialism. Because this contest for land is a contest for life, but it's also a contest about the body and the knowledge of that body. So as Gaba and Sorrentino talks about, we cannot theorize anti-Blackness strictly when it is engulfed within the settler colonial paradigm. Because Blackness and slavery are not and cannot be subsumed under settler colonial politics. This is so important. When we talk about slavery, it wasn't simply about forced labor. It wasn't simply about Black lives being forced into capitalism. Or it wasn't simply about a question of, well, bodies migrate to Canada because they want better lives. Our lives cannot be reduced to that. It cannot be reduced so simplistic to that. That we are in search for capitalist citizenship. We are in search for resistance, and we are in search to resist our dehumanization. This question of land dispossession is equally important for Black and African peoples because there's appropriations of land, labor, extermination. And that's why theorizing settler colonialism must engage also African indigeneity is a point I make in my book on reframing Blackness. Because people have never given up on the continent just because they are in different locations. No. We've never given up on African history or African indigeneity. We don't even get to talk about African indigeneity because somehow I see colonialism took away our indigeneity. No, we need to reclaim it. We need to speak about it. But of course, we should be mindful when we speak about African indigeneity, where we are speaking about it. Because to me, speaking about African indigeneity on Turtle Island means to talk about responsibilities, complicities. But it's also to be mindful of this notion of the settler and how people sometimes just equate it with Blackness. To be very, very critical about it. It doesn't mean we have become complicit in the settler nation building project. We have. But the settler is about crime, it's about dispossession, it's about violence, it's about genocide. So let's keep the meaning for what it is. And this is why it's important to ask questions about when we talk about these things. Because if we are not able to talk about it, we cannot forge solidarities. Because we then have this situation where there's this concussion of an adversarial relationship between Blackness and Indigeneity. It only furthers the white supremacist project. We have to find a way to talk about how our histories are intertwined and how we have relative complicities and responsibilities. And the West settler doesn't do the job. All what it does is that it furthers the colonial white supremacist project because it allows it to apply to everybody. And the white settler goes scot-free because he spreads the blame all around. So Afrofuturisms, Afro-Indigenous futurisms is where I'm trying to go and end with. I think also it's a search for Indigenous authenticity and hope. Ours is a search to reclaim our knowledge systems to subvert. This futurism must be an empowerment tool for our own liberation. It must be an ideology which is embedded in our artistic aesthetics for futuristic imaginations and rationalities. It should also be about recuperating from our African and Indigenous knowledges, our psychic and cultural memories, our oral cultures, our fiction literatures, and our magical realisms to articulate creative, speculative imaginaries. Here from when I talk about what would have happened if colonialism had not happened. That's a very powerful question to engage with. Africa will not be what it is. Don't tell me colonialism somehow. Colonialism is an interrupter. Africa would have found its own path. Colonialism was never a savior. I don't see any good of colonialism. Don't tell me about education. It's as if we wouldn't have found our own education and led our education to different lengths and heights. But this Afrofuturism must be able to offer possibilities, implications, and consequences that allow us to teach the cancer of anti-Black and Indigenous racisms in our schools. This Afrofuturisms, Afro-Indigenous futurisms, will allow us to re-envision the school curriculum, to reimagine African Indigenous histories as a totality of our people's lived experiences. And as I've said, it's a spiral, it's not a linear. We don't move from the past to the present to the future. No, it's back and forth. That's what our history is. Back and forth, it's spiral, back and forth. And we need this education to focus on our desires, our hopes, our aspirations, and our resistance, our ancestral knowledge of being and seeing. It's so important. So to conclude, at this time when we're talking about anti-Black racism in the movement of Black history, we have to build communities. Communities are not in space, we don't plot them. We build, we work hard, and we do it one day at a time. So we build communities. Again, that's one of my students saying, Ellen Cogan talks about, let's see ourselves as becoming, quote, prophets of what could be. Let's be prophets of what could be. That imagination, that possibilities. Lena Simpson says, we are not living in a new present. She says we are living in a new present, sorry. We are living in a new present. I agree. But to me, we are also building a new future, and this should not be either or. We are living in a new present, but also building new futures. It's not an either or. While our past is not our future, the past as lessons for this future. This is why we need to reframe this politics of refusal. It's about disruption, divestment, resistance, strategic, and we work within, around, and outside, and work with radical and speculative imaginaries. When we see our schools, we see our schools as contested spaces where we are in combat, we are in war. There's war going on in our universities, wars over knowledge. That's why we have to become academic warriors. We have to become academic warriors. We have shared responsibilities and accountability to our communities. Otherwise, our communities will see us as very elitist if we don't have that responsibility and accountability. We cannot become products of our institutions. My friend Nyamla talks about being intellectual imposters, where we become intellectual imposters, because we are not who we are. We are not our true, authentic self. We are mimicking. We mimic the theories, we mimic the knowledge system, we mimic what is expected of us because we want to be accepted, we want to be validated, we want to be legitimized. We are intellectual imposters. Let's be our true, authentic self. Through resistance, we saw the seeds of decolonization. And it used to be, right? It used to be. And this is why when Carmen and I talk about specialty of operations, and this is where we're coming from. You see, our institutions are built on indigenous people's lands. They use Black labor to construct the architecture in which we learn in. And yet our students, Black indigenous students, racialized students, always are having a cap in hand, begging for something to be done. So we want Black History Month, and we have to beg for them to give us some money to have Black History Month. We shouldn't be begging. We make demands because these institutions are on our ancestors' lands. Our ancestors built our institutions, whether it's African labor, Chinese, Asian labor, and that. So we make demands. So rather than say these institutions were not meant for us, so we are here to learn and go away. No, we need to make demands. That's the specialty of operations. We need to make demands. But in doing this work, always remember that there's a swahunu, a realistic space that it calls for, where there's a synergy of the body, mind, soul, and spirit. Because what we do, what we learn, what we teach, the work we do, there has to be a sanctity and a sacredness of activity, because that's what makes us human. You can't build a community without humanness. You can't learn without that humility. You can't struggle without recognizing that the struggle is to regain your humanity. That's the sanctity of work that is required. And as they say in Kiswahili, Asante sana.
Wow, thank you so much, Nana, for such a candid presentation, so clear presentation. And it speaks a lot, because what I'm picking up is, like, right from the beginning, it's very clear that Black bodies have not mattered in the Western Hemisphere. As you speak about it, it's also very clear that at this moment, you're directing us to start imagining the death of Black bodies in the US. It's interesting because even in Canada, the first thing we do is, oh, that happens in the US. And that was very interesting what you said, because it's not just that it's like that, it also helps to sanitize Canada as a very welcoming society. But we know that in such form of sanitization, there are particular other bodies that have been killed, destroyed.
Yeah.
Land has been taken away. That it's historical. It's not like it's happening with the death of George Floyd, or it's happening with the death of Terry Nicole, but it's just an expression of how this society that we call Canada tries to sanitize itself by reflecting itself against America. A story is told of like the way Black communities passing through the railway line coming to Canada, and there's that story about Canada, how safe Canada is. But we don't want to give an account of how Canada was, Canadian settler communities were stealing lands from Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
And if there's anything that you put across is, I will never, and I cannot, we cannot think or imagine Blackness without also thinking about Indigenous communities in this land.
Exactly.
We can't. It's not possible. It's how we are so interlocked, how we speak into each other, and how we breathe into each other's life.
Yeah.
And what you brought about is also the question about, I cannot breathe, right? The other day, when Tyler Nicole was killed, there was this reporter who was asking, did Tyler Nicole say, I cannot breathe? Which is weird. It's a white man, white reporter asking, did he say, I cannot breathe? And I'm like, this is interesting. Like, how can you ask us such a question, right? Then the next thing, it's also about, for example, and I think you brought this complexity about Blackness. So here are the police officers who have killed a Black man. And then all of a sudden we are so quick, especially in Canada, to put a statement out there, especially the OPP, like put a statement out there, like we don't do that here, right? And I'm like, what is that? Like, what are you trying to tell us in terms of Canada? Like, it's so whatever. Yet we know that there are people like Loku who was killed by police officers. But now, when you spoke about all these things, it drove me to even our own social work, because I teach social work.
Right.
So there's this quick way of sanitizing ourselves as social workers, that we are so good. We are the people who help those Black people who have been incarcerated. But we don't want to give an account of how, for example, we've taken children from the residential school system.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll say, okay, that's a history, that it's far away. But actually, you don't see how it manifests itself. Even the child welfare system, where Black and Indigenous children now are being apprehended at a very high rate, disproportionately high rate.
Yeah.
We don't want to give an account of that because we live a society of, economic logics. Neoliberal economic logics that drive even the kind of care that we give. Therefore, as social workers, we also give very violent care. And usually I tell students, it doesn't need to be like you are putting even the knee on the neck of a Black man, but actually there's a way you steal life, you steal for life from communities of, Black communities, Indigenous communities, to LGBTQ plus communities, people living with disability. You steal life out of them. And I think this is the core conversation that I had from your presentation, that if we are ever going to think about Blackness, we have to think of Blackness with other forms of marginalization, because that's how intersecting they are. You cannot think of them in singularity. But the problem we have today is we always think in singularity, and that works very well for the markets and colonization and imperialism, right? So anyways, you have a lot of comments here and questions, and I think I'll read one of the questions which says, are the Africans in Africa aware of anti-Blackness?
Well, I think, they are aware of anti-Blackness because they know there's anti-Blackness in Africa. When you look at the police chokehold on its own citizens in Africa, that's anti-Blackness. When you look at the state, the way the state, right, puts a chokehold on its own people, that's anti-Blackness. Right, so there's anti-Blackness in Africa, right? But you see, this is the point. This is why we say it's structural. The dehumanization of the Black body, right? That it doesn't count. It doesn't matter, right? So when you have these leaders think somehow through their education they have become separate from the masses. They are not like the masses, right? And that's the anti-Blackness thinking of anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is not a white-Black stuff, right? It's a mentality. It's a culture. That is ingrained, right? When we need to understand that, yes, so there is, right? But there are also cases when we look at South Africa. There are clear cases, right, of anti-Blackness in South Africa. People who call themselves as Africans, but they see themselves as different from the Indigenous Africans, right? That's anti-Blackness, right? So it is, right? When in Nigeria, the police brutalize its citizens. That's anti-Blackness, because they are not worth living, right? When we have state leaders work with policies of the World Bank and the IMF that put chokeholds on the survival, the well-being of their own citizens, isn't that anti-Blackness?
The other question is coming from Dave Monix, who's asked, I would like to hear your thoughts around economic violence that Black people have faced for centuries and how it impacts and affects their futures.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when we look at economic violence, let's look at the global extractivism of slavery, capitalism, and how these are still ongoing. So we look at, let's go back to slavery, for example, right? The Middle Passage, right? We always talk about, let's forget about the gold and the resources that were stolen. The human intellectual capacity, right? When you take a whole generation from a people, you are creating a gap, right? So that's also material and economic, right? Economic. And also you look at it in terms of the destruction that it caused on communities. Then we look at the policies, the World Bank and the IMF, the way they have, right? They talk about tightening belts. Let's tighten up belts. How do you tighten belts when you don't have a belt in the first place? How can you tighten a belt when you don't have a belt? So people sit in Washington and the IMF, they would sit in Washington and develop policies for rural communities on the continent, right? So this is ongoing. The ongoing legacies are still there, and we are still suffering from it, right? We are still suffering from it, right? And part of it is how we conceptualize development, because rather than finding our own path to development, we believe that the path to development has to be through the linear Western modernization path. So to have a first-class road, to build a first-class hospital is development. Rather than look at what we can do through our own local resources and creativity. That we don't need to have or follow the path. In fact, the late Makandere talks about that, and Josnyere also talked about it, right? That while others walk, Africans must run, right? Because we want to catch up. And that's a problem. Let's find our own path, right? And when we talk about, the point is that some of us, right, we talk about these issues, right? Oh, but the prophets now believe in their own communities. Well, let's have a white scholar come in there and talk about these things. They are more intellectual. The African scholar, this one. And sometimes this nonsense about, we talk about like somehow as if you can only do good when you're on the continent. There are scholars on the continent who are doing even worse in terms of the knowledge they are producing. So Eurocentric knowledge. So dehumanization of the Black existence, right? So we have to be very critical about these nuances of it, right?
Thank you, Nana. The other question comes from, and I think this is a very interesting question because, and I think you and other pioneers on anti-racism have talked about how, for example, when we try to bring the question about change, you know, in our educational setting, in our workplaces, there is always that aspect of reference to us as very violent, or we are so loud, and it sounds like we are so emotional. And there's that aspect of like, you know, you know, we need, because now we are the people who are bringing change, who are seeking change, that we need to, you know, bring down our anger, you know, we need to control our anger, like we need to rationalize our anger and our emotions. And there's this market orientation now, which is coming up, that you need to present your issues more like a sandwich. So there is on top the good news, in between what you need to do, the other side what needs. And for me, I feel like that is what Lakeisha is asking. It sounds more like gaslighting. So I heard from the speaker, we need to demand and not beg. This is sometimes seen as aggressive. Belonging is shown through representation in our community. Is there any book you can refer to teach me how to demand? Because it almost have to be done delicately or politely to still be employed?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think to me, this is what we have to talk about, politics of refusal, right? And talk about it differently, right? And I think this is what I always talk about new African young scholars, right? These are the things that we have to pioneer new analytical systems for understanding our community. So this is one thing, this one area that I would like to call on Lakeisha to think through, right? That what does it mean to demand and not beg, right? And so we work with the specialty of operations, as the piece that we are writing about, right? We talks about, yes, the institutions are built on our ancestors' lands, right? For indigenous people's lands. They use Black labor, they use Asian labor, they use Chinese labor to construct the architecture in which we learn from. It's immoral for us to be begging, right? It's immoral for us to be begging. In fact, they owe us because of that history. They owe us because of that history. And when people talk about where there's anger, well, to me, it's passion. The passion. We can't talk about these things over a cup of tea, right? We can't talk about them over a cup of tea, right? So you brutalize, and then all what you're doing is, oh, let's smile about it. Let's be nice about it, right? We have to show our emotions. Emotions are equally intellectual, right? But also the point is that there are going to be different strategies. And I write about this, that there are different strategies of anti-racist education, for example. There are going to be different models. I think to me, if somebody wants to take the path of presenting it in a different way, that's fine. But don't tell me that my path somehow is not worthy of pursuing, right? That's the point. There are different models of anti-racist work, right? So it cannot be a hierarchy. And this is a problem that I had with abolitionist theories, right? Because some of the abolitionist theories were asking for a sharp break, right? But it's very important to look at the past and the lessons, right? There's a account word of the Sankofa. So when we talk about abolition, yes, we want to break colonial structures. But how do we break colonial structures? If we don't learn from the past, we are going to create new colonial structures, right? And this is why it's so important. And that's why we talk about that spiral, right? The Bolivian feminist scholar talks about the indigenous modernity. That is not a linear progression, but it's a back and forth. So we use that indigenous modernity to trouble Western modernity, which is so linear, right? Sees a shift from past, present to the future. No, the past, present, and future are intertwined. So in this moment, when we talk about African history, let's look at African history as a time for us to reclaim the past for its lessons, to reflect on our current condition of existence as African peoples, and to be futuristic about that, to project onto the future, that what we want for our communities, what we want for the African humanhood, right? But as you said, that you see this in relationalities and not get into this idea where there's this concorded adversarial relationships among oppressed peoples, right? That somehow, well, you can't talk about this. And look, how can you talk about indigeneity, indigenous decolonization, and not talk about race, or vice versa? It's not either or, right? It's not either or. And this is what I meant by the notion of the settler, right? That yes, we have to talk about complicities. We have complicities and responsibilities. But the settler is about violence. It's about dispossession. It's about stealing lands. That's what the settler is about, right? The person who comes into a territory claiming that nobody ever existed until they came into that space. You can't put that word on everybody, right? You can't put that word on. Let's be critical about it. And when we say this, we are not running away from responsibilities. But what we are talking about is that we have to be careful of white supremacist logics. The way it works is it positions us and makes us all complicit in a way that leaves them off the hook. That's what we're talking about. And we need to address that. This is why Black indigenous relationships are very, very important. Because yes, we have responsibilities. You cannot be on Turtle Island and not understand indigenous teachings and ethnic teachings. But we have to ask the question, what can we also bring with our indigenous knowledge systems to strengthen? I always tell my students, right, that one of the things I started talking about indigeneity is because when I came here, I saw how Turtle Island scholars were speaking about that indigeneity. And I said, wait a minute. Yes, there's something to be spoken about in my context. And that I'm not going to accept a colonial appellation of indigenous, which is that the dominant will define what is indigenous. No, I'm not going to let that happen, right? The indigenous is defined by bodies who are indigenous, not by the dominant.
I'll leave now the space for Dr. Suleiman Demi to continue.
Okay. Nana, thank you very much for this, such a wonderful presentation. I mean, you took us back to classroom again. And that reminds me of all that. There's this, I mean, you raised so many important issues that we can, I mean, look at. One is, for example, how, I mean, to name things the way they are.
Yeah.
And that also reminds us of the power of discourse, because
Yeah.
there is a reason why people would prefer to use discrimination instead of racism.
Yeah.
Or maybe they will use different racism instead of anti-Black racism,
Right.
in that context. So it's such a powerful, I mean, because discourse, what discourse it makes us to feel good about ourselves when actually there's something hidden. And in that sense too, we use that kind of discourse to undermine the activism within the Black community. So it was such a powerful, I mean, thing that I heard from you. And another thing also that you raised, which is very, very important, is, I mean, we usually always use that term, it takes a village to raise a child. And you just mentioned that not only that, but we also need to create the community.
Yes.
So in my sense, I want you to, if you can talk more about how can we create that community,
exactly,
how we can raise the golden child.
Yeah, and it relates to a point that Danisa was making, right?
Yeah.
How do we build relationships?
Exactly.
Right? You can't build communities without relationships, right? So building communities means then that we can't leave anybody behind. Yeah. But we have to bring people. We have to bring people along, right? We have to be very critical of our own selves, right? Critical of our own selves, right? And I mean, look, how can you, for example, do anti-racist work, anti-Black racism work, and not be critical of Black police officers because they have embedded the police culture? You said what you heard what our captain talks about, right? There's nothing so offensive than when people fight to open doors and you get in there, right? And you do exactly what those who were closing the doors were doing. That's so offensive, right? We can't build committees with that. We have to talk about our responsibilities. So we build committees one brick at a time. We build committees one brick, own up to our responsibilities, own up to that we are on this journey and we have a collective responsibility to each other. It's also dealing with the power issues that are embedded, right? Because sometimes, I mean, when we talk about Black, right, as I talk about heterogeneity of Blackness, sometimes when we talk about what is missing in conversations about the Black, what is missing, right? Sometimes we talk about anti-Black racism, but there's anti-African racism as well. So you can't build communities without raising those issues, because what has happened that we've been made complicit in that, right? And this is why it's so important to talk about that, right? And that's what was saying, right? That building this relationship, we also talk about, let's look at our collective journeys. They are different. Not sometimes I talk about shared histories. Shared histories doesn't mean it's singular history. Shared history doesn't mean it's a singular history. Our histories are shared, but they are not singular. They are connected. They are connected, right? You hear the saying, we are here because you were there, right? What people say, we are here because you were there. That's so powerful to work with, right? We are here because you were there, right? But also being here means we have a responsibility to take up causes of those people who allowed us to come into their communities, right? So when Indigenous people are talking about self-determination and self-autonomy struggles, right? We can't stay aloof. We have to be part of it. We have to be part of it. And by the same token too, when we are talking about anti-Blackness, right? They cannot stay aloof. They also have to speak about it because it affects us collectively. That's how we build communities. That's how we build communities, right? Because what it is that there's a particular logic, and that logic is a colonial logic that always divides. That always divides. And we have to move away from those colonial logics. But when I talk about, for example, the black and white prism, it doesn't mean we can't have white critical friends. We have white critical friends who are part of the struggle and they implicate themselves, right? They are not coming to the struggle reproducing their privilege. If you come to the struggle to reproduce your privilege, please stay away because you are creating another problem for us. So if you are genuinely a critical friend, acknowledge your privilege and your power, right? And see what you can do to undo that, right? Michelle Fine, right, talks about being a white anti-racist feminist scholar, right? She talks about going to the courts and she noticed that the judges, she gives testimony because she's on race and racism, right? She noticed that when she's speaking, the judges pay attention very well to everything that she says. But say, and this is an example I'm giving, say if Sule was making the same point that she's making, the judges will roll their heads because Sule is black, or what else do you expect? He's going to say that. And so she asked the judges, why do you have that different reaction? That's the problem, right? That's the problem. We validate certain bodies. People speak on our behalf. That audacity, where people think they know us more than we know ourselves. That's why we have to tell our stories. Retelling our stories, retelling our lives. Bell Hooks a long time ago talked about this, but it's so powerful that we need to retell our stories. We need to retell our stories.
Wonderful. Yeah. I think one thing that you also mentioned, I mean, which is powerful, is the fact that, I mean, the institutions that reward silence.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, kind of pervasive. So, for example, when you are in academia and you keep quiet, that's where you are seen as academics or knowledgeable.
Yeah.
And in that sense. So, I think, I mean, in the past, I think you mentioned about how to be academic warriors. So if you want to throw more light on that, for example, we are in institutions.
Two things, right? I mean, the question of the silence and how academic was silent. Look, if you're a Black, Indigenous, racialized scholar, you have to have a community behind you.
Exactly.
You have to have a community behind you. But what I mean is that your work must be relevant to your communities.
Yeah.
Right? Because at the end of the day, it's our communities that sustain us, that give us the grounding to help us do. We see communities are not created in space. We don't plug them, we build them. So we create communities. Some people say, oh, what is this Black community? Black community doesn't mean everybody belongs. No, but there is a community that we create, we build, right? And then we become critical friends in that community. And that's what I mean by that notion of being an academic warrior, right? Because there's a lot of silence in academia. You forget the history. Also, right? And I'm using first names because of my relationship with the two of you, right? You know, you come into the university and you think, oh, I got in there simply because I was too smart, right? That's why I got to the University of Toronto. And that's why I was able to get my PhD and that. Of course, we know you are smart. That's not the point. The point is to recognize the history that made it possible for you to get in there. Because people had to fight to create. People had to fight to validate other knowledges, right? So if you have been able to get through producing counter knowledges, recognize that there was at some point when that knowledge was not validated, when even your humanity was not even acknowledged, right? And so to me, to be that academic warrior, right, is to be a warrior in both words, right? That your words must be powerful. Your words must pierce. Your words must speak about the silences. Your words must show courage. Your words must address the oppressions, the violences that happen, and not just be quiet about them because you want to move ahead. Because that itself can be wounding if no one talks about it, because you are not your true self. You're not your true self. You become an imposter, right? You're not your true self. This is why remember one research that we did in the schools, right? The funny thing is when we ask students in high school, how many Black teachers do you have in your school? And in that school, it happened that technically they had 2 Black teachers, but some of the students said they only have 1. And another student said, no, we have 2, right? So we were confused. So we asked the students, why are you saying 1 and others are saying 2? So the first people who said 1, right, asked those who said 2, could you tell us the second person you are speaking about? Because we know 1. And then they mentioned the name. They said, oh, you include him in that one too? Because we thought he was part of the, right? You see, students can tell.
Yeah.
Students can tell. They can tell. It doesn't mean that the teacher is not Black. Of course they are Black, but Black is about what? Being political, right? It's about resistance. Our life is about resistance, right? The Black existence is about resistance. It's about fight, right? Nothing has been given to us on a silver platter. We had to fight for everything that we got. Our ancestors had to fight for it. And we owe it to our ancestors. Otherwise, it's a disservice to ancestors when we forget this struggle. This is why I say, through our struggles, we sow the seeds of our own decolonization. We sow the seeds of our own decolonization.
That's powerful. So if you want to, I mean, let the people, if somebody wants to also talk.
I think I would like to recognize the presence of our EDI lead, Vivian, who is with us. I don't know, is Vivian, did you get, like, I think Vivian, you can speak, right? Vivian, you have access to that, I think so.
I think I can speak now. Thank you.
Let me promote you to.
Hi, Vivian.
Are you? I'm trying to make you a panelist, Vivian. Okay, so I just want to recognize the presence of Vivian. Vivian is our EDI lead.
Right.
Vivian has been doing a lot of work when it comes to this kind of work that we are doing.
Yeah, and
Vivian has been our biggest, our biggest support here. Vivian is like, you know, was the one actually who, you know, when we came here, we didn't know where we are heading to. Vivian actually who actually sent me a message on LinkedIn. So I just wanted to recognize that and just to give Vivian a time just to say something to you.
Thank you so much, Dio and Suleiman and George, and of course, Jane. Such an honor to have you here again, Nana. And just wanted to say that every time I hear your words, I am so inspired. And every time I hear your words, I am reminded of why I'm here. And it's because of mentors like yourself. And you're so right to say that we have to acknowledge, you know, all of those bodies, people's bodies, knowledges, and all of the struggles, right, and the fights that were won, so that we are here today in all of our diversities and connecting through all of our shared values and visions for that future. And when you speak about that futurity, it just really brings me some more energy to continue on this work, on this path that, you know, can be quite isolating. And for those of us that take a political stand, recognizing our identities, not just as mere cultural artifacts, but as a way to make space and to continue building from the ground up. You know, it's an honor again to keep hearing how you keep evolving and theorizing and making all of these wonderful propositions that remind us of what our responsibilities and accountabilities are if we are truly to decolonize and not continue recreating the colonialist architecture that you so humbly talk about. And thank you. And thank you, Dave.
So powerful said, and I feel your work. So listen, you know, I mean, you are talking about the history. One of the things with anti-racist and anti-Black racism work is that, right, people have to recognize the history behind this work, right? Sometimes we have people who come to this work thinking all of a sudden they have discovered everything, right? Without recognizing the long history that people had to. Anti-racism began in the community, right? It began in the community. The community it were intellectuals, they were mothers, right? Mothers right, were concerned, particularly about the school system, what it was doing to their kids, right? And people have built on that. So we built on knowledges, right? And that, and we need to recognize that. And one thing, and I always talk about this humility, right? Anytime you go into a space, you have to be humble in your claim to know. Because if you are humble in your claim to know, you leave that space knowing more, right? Because we in academia, right, there's this certainty of knowledge that people even fear to say, I don't know. Because there's punishment when you say, I don't know. There's punishment, right? And that power of not knowing is something we need to cultivate in our learners, because it allows them to unlearn and to know.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you, Vivian. I would also like to include, bring forth to you our members of community. We have a Kano president here with us. As a school, we've tried now this time to work closely with the Kano, and we have the support of Dave Monix.
Mm-hmm.
Dave Monix is president of Akano. Dave Monix, it's your time.
Oh, this was amazing. I felt like I was back in the classroom. So thank you, Dr. George Day. And, I haven't seen you in a long time, so
Yeah,
it's a pleasure.
right.
The last time you were in the Sioux, me and Vivian and others worked to make sure that you were here. And
Yeah.
I know that I've grown a little bit from that experience. So thank you for the work that you continue to do and the work that you're doing in the future. Really appreciate it. It was great hearing your voice today.
Sure.
For me though, I want to spin the conversation a little bit, because everybody here right now is academic and I'm community, and I'm always fascinated about how do we connect community to this conversation.
Right.
I had the pleasure today of having the opportunity to be at the Old Stone House talking to a community of 25 people and having some of these conversations. And that's what sparked my conversation, my question about economic violence, right? My thing is, as I said to Jane and Dio and others who was on the call, how do we bring this conversation to the community? Because for me, every time I'm engaged in this conversation, it's from an academic space. And yes, we need it in there, but I think where the learning needs to happen is in that community space, as we talk so much about community tonight in this conversation. So I am passionate about that. I commit myself and put my hand up every time to be out there to do the work, because for me, I'm not looking anywhere else. I'm looking at as Dr. Day said earlier on tonight, I'm looking at my responsibility.
Right.
What can I do in every moment as who I am as a being with my own lived experience and education? And I take that responsibility seriously. As someone said earlier on, I'm standing on the backs and shoulders of giants. And as I said today, so many people died for me to be here.
Exactly.
So I take what I do seriously, and I'm fearless about it. I'm not rude, I'm fearless about it. And I have made the ultimate sacrifice once I finish my education. I have a responsibility to disrupt.
Exactly.
To disrupt the narrative, no matter who you are, no matter where I am. And so I take that seriously. But my question again is, we have, as Dr. George Day said earlier on, we have a responsibility to make this kind of rich quality conversation a part of the community, because to me, that's where the teaching needs to happen. That's where the learning needs to happen. And for me, I find too much that it happens in the intellectual sphere. And therefore, I believe we missed the boat and missed the opportunity of really having that conversation out there. So that's my question that I really want to put forward to the panel. Come up with some ideas moving forward.
No, you're right. I think, look, for us as Black racialized scholars, right, our definition of the intellectual space, it's not the university space, right? That's not our definition. Our definition of the intellectual space has to be a space that engages a community, because we need a community for the spiritual backbone. And one of the things that we have is that we always have this idea where we are always suspects in the eyes of our communities, right? Not because we are scholars, no, but in terms of what we do, and sometimes the fact some of us put our own communities under the bus in order to get ahead, right? So we have always come back, and this is why we have that responsibility to address that within our communities, right? Where do our research questions come from, right? How do we create spaces that we bring in communities and share, right? Sule and Dionyso would tell you about, we have a study group, right, at OISI. And that study group is made up of communities who come in the last day of every month for us to have intellectual exchanges. And through that, we get ideas that we work with and that. So there are different ways we can talk about that, right? And I think to me, one of the ways is to ask the questions, where do our research questions and investigations come from? How is our research relevant to communities' aspirations? There are certain research personally I don't do, not because I don't see them relevant, but because my communities don't see them at the top of their list, right? And that. So it's very, very important for us to see. And I remember when we did the work on dropout or push out, right? That time I had been hired at OISI, and you know about, I've been hired at OISI where all this thing about where OISI having this fed black tenured African professor and all that, right? And I went to, I was a member of the Organization of Parents of Black Children. And this mother looked at me and said, oh, I was reading that you've been hired at OISI, so what are you going to do? And I said, well, I just came here, right? So I don't know yet. He said, well, I have a topic for you, right? And I said, yes, what topic is that? I said, yeah, you've heard the term dropout. That's what he took. You've heard the term dropout. I said, yeah. He said, well, we've been reading dropout from all these dominant scholars. Could you also look at the problem of why our students drop out? Maybe you could shed a light on how our students leave school prematurely. And so this is where our whole study on the dropout came from. So where our research questions come from become very, very important. And working in partnership with our communities, creating the space for our communities to be part of this dialogue, right? But also remember that we can't be a Black scholar not rooted in community, right? Dominant scholars get away with that, but we can never get away with that because of the predicament of the Black racialized scholar in academia, right? You need support, right? Especially when we have so few of us in academia. Your only recourse will be to have that community. This is why, again, when something will happen and the community will write to the university saying, well, you have your first tenured Black professor. If something happens to him, we are holding you responsible. That's so strong, right? And if the university president will say, oh, that's, wow, you have a community writing about, you have your first Black professor, if something happens to him, we hold you personally responsible, right? And you can't be a scholar and forget that the committee was there for you, right? That you have your credibility at stake. And that credibility requires that your work becomes relevant, that you speak out, right? Because academia so seduces us, right? It seduces us and makes us forget about our communities. It makes us put our communities under the bus, right? And it makes us become more elitist, right? That we draw our distinctions, us and the them, from our communities. And I think we ask a very, very important question. And this is why we have to look at strategies, how we bring communities, how we also go into communities, have conversations, and how we see ourselves also as part of our communities. Just because we are in the academy doesn't mean we don't belong to communities. We belong to communities, right? And we should never forget that.
Okay, thank you. We want to recognize the president of African Sentiments community, Mr. Evran, if you want to say something.
Good evening, my brothers and sisters. Sorry, I came into the conversation pretty late. We had a meeting preparing for our Black History Month, and that stretched into hours. Sorry, I just came into the conversation pretty late. But I had a lot of things that the professor said, and he was very, very correct. In fact, this evening, my wife and I were just talking about the academic system and how our brothers who have joined the system now behave like the white man in the system.
Yeah.
You know, we just had that conversation, you know, just an hour or two ago, you know, and she said, instead of going there to help with the issue, they are joining people to, you know, suppress
Yeah.
To suppress the voices of our fellow students who are there, and that resonated with me, when I heard Professor say that, So going forward, I'm just hoping that this conversation will not just end with Black History Month.
Right.
That we take it beyond here, and that has been my drive, while we started African Community in Timmins. I came in here about a year, it's going to 2 years now, and I saw what happened, and like if we don't have a cohesive force, it will be easy to divide and rule us,
right.
So I saw the need for us to come together and form and have a voice. Firstly, firstly be visible, then have a voice. Then things can go before there. Then we'll become part of the demographics in Timmins. We won't be seen as just people migrating to Timmins. No, we'll have a voice, we'll have a say, and hopefully to snowball into something really big. So I just want to appreciate you, Professor, for what you're doing, for the good work. I want to appreciate you, Jane. Thank you so much for all your support. Honestly, we wouldn't have done a lot without you. Demi, I appreciate you so much. My good friend, thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate you guys more.
Yeah, and if I can make 3 points of what you're saying. One is the whole question of the competitive nature of the spaces in which we work, right? It's so competitive. So sometimes we pit ourselves against each other, right? Because that's the political economy of the academia, right? We become so competitive and become so individualistic, right? And we need to break that, right? We can't do this work without breaking that. Their second issue has to do with the question of mentorship, right? Mentorship is very, very important, right? Mentorship. And I think as Black academics, we have to mentor. And mentorship is a two-way street. It's not just simply a senior faculty mentoring a younger faculty. A younger faculty can mentor a senior scholar, right? It's a two-way street. So mentorship is something that we have to deal with in academia, right? It's something as Black scholars to be able to deal with. And then the third point, it's also the question about how we maintain our own sanity to do this work. This work can be killing. It can be killing. So we have to maintain our sanity in doing it. And this is why spirituality, right, is so important, African spirituality. Because African spirituality, indigenous spirituality, right, they hold communities together, right, by their teachings, by their ontologies and epistemologies, and how we work with that, right, becomes so important in that regard, right? Because it's when we look at what happens in academia, right, where there's so much competition, where I can't tell you the many times, for example, when you do joint publication, people would say, "Oh, we want to know how much you contributed, right, to that joint publication." And that's the culture, right? That's the culture of that, right? And we have to break that. We have to break that. We break that by thinking through African conceptions of community, right? And African conceptions of community are laden and embedded in spiritual values, right? Responsibilities, ethics, that there's a sanctity of the work that we do, that we always have to respond to something bigger than ourselves. It may not be here now, but that bigger than ourselves is, say, our ancestors, our elders, right? Because the elder crit, the teachings of our elders, the elder crit, right? It's about community responsibility in the sense of being ethical in what we do.
Wow, thank you so much, Nana, for such a candid examination of how our society looks like. I will tell you this, I grew up in Kenya, and one thing that I know is I grew up with my grandma, so we would be visited, my auntie would visit us, or somebody would visit us, And they would talk and I will sleep and I wake up at 2 o'clock, they are still talking, they're just repeating and they continue talking. And I kept asking myself, what is this? Like, what is this that they are talking? And they're just talking until it's morning.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say is this conversation, we can talk and talk and talk, but there's something about that talk and talk and talk. It's about the repetition until we transform the way we think about our society. And I think that's a very fundamental aspect of who we are as Black community. We tell stories, we repeat stories because we want to affirm those stories. So I just want to thank you so much for having joined us today. And I want to leave this space by saying, I am because we are. And I'll leave this space to Jane Omolo to take over from me.
Wow, what an evening. I hope nobody's looking at the time. Such an exciting and an evening full of knowledge and wisdom from you, Nana. We are so, so happy that you'd make the time to be here with us again and really flash out some of the main highlights and important things that we need to focus on. Because when I look at the communities that we have found ourselves in, I've always said that nothing happens by chance. There's so much belief that each one of us is where we are because we need to be where we are at the time that we are there. Right. And so what can we each do to make sure we lift each other up? Yeah. What can we do to make sure that we are leaving a legacy, a lasting impression and impact on the communities that we are living with? Because I think if we gave each other a challenge to do that and do the work that needs to be done, we will be so much ahead. So all I can say is thank you so much for being here today. Everyone who stayed until the end, I want to thank you again. And I hope that we'll continue to partner together. Everard, I'm so excited to see you here, at least to put a face to the events that have been going to and fro. And we're so happy to see the African community in Timmins grow. It reminds me when we started our own community here in Sault Ste. Marie. Davis here as a testimony to where we have come from 2000 and something and right now. It was just small. We started like by having potlucks. A few families come together, we bring food and we enjoy the food and we enjoy the conversations and the music. And then we realized, oh my God, my living room wasn't big enough to have everybody, so where'd we move? So we moved to a different space. And that space the following year, we couldn't fit there. So we moved to Sioux College. And in a year, we couldn't fit in Sioux College. So we looked for a room outside that could fit all of us. And when I reflect back at where we've come from and where we are, it's not easy for the newcomers to be able to visualize that. But always what I've said is, if we can come in and bring that joy, if we can come in and bring that assistance, if we can come in and add to the value of being together as a community, we will go far. So thank you for being here today. I hope that you'll have time to join us again in other upcoming events. We have another panel speaking event on Friday. Then we are looking forward to a big event in Timmins. And then the biggest of all events, our dinner event here in Sault Ste. Marie. So if there are any members here who haven't bought your tickets, please don't blame me or Dave or Rimas or Gilbert if you have no seat. Because sometimes we wait for the last minute to buy our tickets. Get our tickets right now, and we are looking forward to engaging all of you. So thank you so much. Have a good night, have a great weekend, and be blessed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
Okay, that worked well.
Thank you.
See you, everybody. See you, my friend. See you. That was good, Sule. Let me remove this. Stop recording.